A man is sleeping on a couch. His name is Danny. He is abruptly woken up by a sudden and violent earthquake. He quickly reaches for his phone, and calls his girlfriend, Gwen, to check on her. Gwen says that she's fine. The earthquake wasn't too close to her. But Danny wants to talk more because they are having relationship issues. Gwen is irritable and doesn't want to talk about their issues. Danny's father walks into the living room. He doesn't seem too distraught by the earthquake. They both sit down and watch the news. The weather reporter says that it was a 6.0 magnitude earthquake. She eerily hints that it might not be the end, and that something bigger may follow. In the morning, we see the barn that Danny's father lives in. It's in a sorry state. The doors are creaky and the place is a mess. Danny's father fiddles with the radio. He suddenly feels a sharp pain, and sees a bite mark on his leg. He's been bitten by some kind of insect. Danny empties a jar and uses it to store the strange-looking insect. He wants to show it to his girlfriend, Gwen, who is a scientist. A car pulls into the barn. It's Gwen. She steps out and Danny approaches her. She's clearly not satisfied being with Danny. He shows her the jar, and she's rude to him because bugs are not her specialty. Danny is trying to reconcile, but Gwen wants to move on. She doesn't want to fix the relationship. But Danny tries to convince her to stay over for dinner. It's the Thanksgiving holiday. Gwen is extremely apprehensive about staying because of Danny's father. Apparently Danny's father is a bad person, and made a fool of himself last Christmas. She takes the insect jar and heads back to her car. She looks at the jar one last time before storing it. No one seems to know what this insect is. Danny goes into the garage. His father unveils their project car. They have been working on it for a while and are both very proud of it. The father shows Danny the new paint job and they talk about the future repairs needed. We see Gwen now. She's in a lab. She took the jar to one of her friends. Turns out, it's a never-before-seen species of worm. Her friend is very excited for the discovery of a new species. The worm is ominous. Because unlike other worms, it has some very aggressive features. Like this sharp spike on its tail end. It is also very large compared to other worms, so the scientist hypothesizes that the worm must have come from very deep underground. Suddenly, they look at the worm sample. It's leaking a foul liquid everywhere, and it has also swollen. The worm is still growing despite being seemingly dead. It's later now, and the scientist friend tries to call Gwen, but there's no answer. She leaves her a message saying that the worm sample is extremely toxic. Anyone bitten by this worm would suffer severe effects within a few hours. She advises Gwen to tell Danny, and hangs up. The scientist is immediately eaten by an enormous worm. Back at the barn and Danny is still working on the car, his father shows him an antique revolver he bought at a roadshow for a lot of money. Danny looks at the gun. He's very impressed by it. Danny goes out to shoot it. Danny's father feels a sudden itch in his back. There's a worm there. He throws it to the ground and crushes it. He lifts his pant leg and we see that the bite looks much worse now. Danny comes back in and his father acts like everything is fine. They're both working under the car now, but another earthquake strikes. This one is much worse. A big shockwave is released, and a cell tower explodes. Danny tries to rescue his father, who is unable to move from under the car. We see a giant crack forming on the ground, which causes the car to fall off the jack, crushing Danny's legs and his father's upper half. Danny is knocked out. He wakes up some time later and finds himself pinned by the car. His father lies next to him, unresponsive. He tries pulling his father out in the hopes that he's alive, but he sees his crushed head. Danny breaks down crying and comes to terms with his father's death. Danny sees a broom and it's barely out of reach. He grabs onto it and tries to use it to leverage the car. He fails. The broom snaps in half. He's helpless now. He reaches for his phone in his pocket. To his horror, it's extremely low charge. He tries calling emergency services but he can't get through. They are extremely busy from the recent earthquakes. Danny undoes his belt and ties around his legs. He winds it extremely tight around his legs. The pain knocks him out for a few hours. The neighbor's dog has wandered into the property. Danny tries to lure it in by calling its name. It gets close, but then we hear a whimper. Something bad has happened to it. A police officer arrives at the barn. Apparently someone has called them to check in on Danny and his father. He goes around the property, looking for a sign of life. He comes upon the garage door and sees the dog. It has been eaten clean, Only the bones and some fur remains. He slowly inches closer and sees movement under a patch of fur. He sees strange boils formed on the dog's skeleton full of that foul liquid. They are worm eggs. Danny finally wakes up, only to hear the police officer pulling out. He's incredibly unlucky. He's still in immense pain. He reaches into his father's pocket and pulls out his phone. It has a passcode. He tries to guess the code, but he's unsuccessful. Danny screams at his dead father to help him out, but obviously the corpse does not respond. Danny reaches into his father's pocket once more and finds a switchblade. He keeps it nearby just in case. He also finds his father's painkiller medications. Danny swallows a mouthful to prepare himself. Danny takes one final look at his feet, and he prepares to do the unthinkable. He looks over at the photos in his father's wallet. He reminisces and gets sad about the past. Danny is interrupted by more rustling. He looks around but can't see anything yet. He looks under the car and there it is, a massive snake-sized worm bites into his leg. He wrestles it and it lunges out from under the car. Danny manages to stab it a few times with the pocket knife, but the monstrous worm gets away. Danny is in even more pain than ever. He shines his light under the car and sees the worm feasting on his dead father. It turns out, the worms don't like the light and the worm scurries into a dark corner. Danny tries to reach the jack on the other side. He tries with the broken broom handle, but it's no use. There's a loose cable next to him, and he tries to lasso the jack with it. He's also unsuccessful, but it gives him another idea. He ties a pair of pliers to the end of the cable and hooks the jack. He is overjoyed. He slowly pulls the jack towards him, careful not to unhook it. He maneuvers it under the car with the crank towards him. Danny uses all of his strength to crank the jack. Slowly but surely, it is being lifted up from his leg. He screams as he's finally free. The worm appears behind him and Danny immediately stabs it with the broom handle. But the worms are very resilient. It still crawls behind him. By some miracle, Danny is able to hop on his legs. He stumbles over to the table when suddenly, another earthquake. But Danny perseveres. He grabs the revolver from the desk. Danny sees the huge worm burrowing into the crack in the floor. He looks down and sees that it's very deep. Danny blocks the hole with all kinds of debris. Anything to keep those worms out. Danny stumbles over to the front of the car. He pulls up his pant leg and looks at his horrific worm bite. It's pulsating and moving as if something is inside. His wound suddenly bursts open, releasing a worm. Danny screams in pain, and falls to the ground. He hallucinates his father's voice. It insults Danny and laughs at him. Danny gets up, still hallucinating his father. He argues with his father's hallucination. Throughout everything, Danny does not want to turn out like his selfish, ungrateful father. Danny realizes how much he has become like his father already. Danny gets some courage and he bangs on the garage door. It's jammed. He finds his eyeglasses on the floor and crawls towards them. Before he wears them, he notices a liquid dripping from the ceiling. He wears his glasses and looks up above. There's a massive worm. The biggest one we've seen so far. It bites into Danny's shoulder. Danny gets it off of him and manages to shoot it with the antique revolver. The worm is injured, and Danny walks over and finishes it off. Danny stumbles into the car and gets in the driver's seat. His wounds are extremely painful and he's barely keeping it together. The worm is somehow still alive after all that and it slams against the window. His phone rings. It's Gwen. He tells her what happened. He tells Gwen that his father is dead, and that he's been bit by the worms multiple times. Gwen tries to calm him because if his heart rate is high, the worm poison will kill him quicker. Gwen assures Danny that she'll come to rescue him. Gwen also reveals that she is pregnant. This gives Danny the motivation to fight through and live. They hang up and Danny checks the gun. Only 3 bullets left. Danny crawls out of the car to get the ammo. Danny grabs the box of ammo and gets back in the car. He loads the revolver and looks around. The coast seems to be clear, so he starts the car. But the worms have now broken through the barricade and are all over the garage. Danny sees that the garage door is blocked by a wooden rod, and that's why it won't open. He looks around inside the car and finds a hatchet. Danny slowly exits the car, carefully looking around to make sure there are no worms. He steps out and swings his hatchet at the door. Danny makes sure to stand in front of the car so that the worms are burned by the headlights if they get close. Danny struggles to break the latch. He begins shooting at it. The police and Gwen have arrived. They rush at the door. But the worms are attacking Danny now. He manages to hold them off with the gun, but he instructs the police to point their headlights at the garage. The officer rushes back into his car to do what Danny says. He moves the police cruiser to point at the garage door while another officer and Gwen try to pry open the door. But time grows short because the project car's battery is dying. They finally get the door loose as a worm inches towards Danny. It almost bites him, but Danny manages to grab it before it does. He pins it to the ground and stabs it repeatedly. Another worm, this one even bigger, leaps at Danny. The worm manages to bite him, but Danny returns the favor. He grabs hold of the worm and bites its neck. He spits out the toxic flesh and the police finally free Danny. They pull him out of the garage. He's writhing in pain. Danny warns them that the worms come out of the cracks in the ground. The police call an ambulance for Danny. Danny and Gwen are in the ambulance car. Danny professes his love for Gwen and passes out. He's pulled into the hospital on a stretcher. Danny is in really bad shape, and the doctors are struggling to know what antivenom to use. But Gwen is here, and she's a scientist. She instructs the doctors of the type of antivenom to use, and they take Danny away. The doctors assure Gwen that they will try their best. The movie ends with Danny waking up in the hospital bed. Gwen is there with him. He's been asleep for a few days. She also tells him that the best scientists in the world are figuring out what the worms are and how to get rid of them.